Hello, sorry I'm late. Welcome, everyone. You write down the participants here. All right, so we're doing overseas imperialism this week. Hopefully you've had a chance to take a look at it, and if not, we'll talk about it today. Let's see here. If you've had any questions lately in the last few days, and I've not had a chance to address it in the Canvas message, note that I'm getting on that and playing catch up. But if you have any questions right now, by all means, I'd be happy to address anything. Let's see here. One, two, three, four, five, six, seven, eight. All right, let's see here. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and then 9. There we go. All right. So let's see here. I'm going to share the screen with the imperialism. Okay. And so so this week, okay, I hope you guys are doing okay. Hope you did okay on your test and took advantage of the option to submit multiple submissions up until the date of Sunday night. So now moving on to test 2 material, we're doing overseas imperialism. And yeah, and so just kind of before we get into it, like I said, are there any questions or comments? Anything that I need to be familiar with? Anything you'd like to share? Oh, okay. All right. So the basic facts, right? In the end of the 1890s, or just the Gilded Age, right? In the last couple decades of the 1800s, as well as into the first couple decades of the 1900s, we developed somewhat of an international empire overseas, right? So for a while there, from the Spanish-American War, we were in Cuba for 4 years. We fought the Spanish-American War in 1898, the spring and summer of 1898. And so from 1898 to 1902, we were in Cuba, occupying it. We took Puerto Rico up to this date in a very kind of awkward situation. We also took Guam up into the end of World War II, as well as the Philippines up until the end of World War II. And we also took Hawaii, right, in the early 1890s. And so now we're getting into the argumentative aspects of it, right? We know what we've done as far as, imposing our will on other sovereign countries across, off the North American continent. But I wanted to get into, discourse as far as dialogue, as far as how they interpret it, what is spoken of, et cetera, right? So firstly, right, you should be able to recognize some court history in this assignment. Remember, court history, C-O-U-R-T, is like an emperor or a king or queen asking a court scribe to write history of him or her, of his or her kingdom. And so it's going to try to justify everything that country, that leader did, right? And try to make that person look as, glowingly as possible. And so the same thing with American court history. Now, we can't deny that we've taken these places. We can't deny that we imposed our will on some of these island nations, etc. And so the best that they can do with court history, right, is to try to justify it, right? And so one component to court history, to us getting involved in overseas empire, is idealism, right? Idealism. Idealism, right? You don't see the world as it is, you see it as it ought to be. You want to improve the world, you have some grand vision for its improvement. And so hence, was there a degree of idealism behind America's imperialism, right? And again, that's a whole other can of worms, whether or not you agree that that ever justifies imperialism, but it's a part of discourse nevertheless. And so, so when you look at number one, for instance, right, you look at these dangerous ideas, these ideas for which their natural logical conclusions could lead to dangerous decisions, right? Some of these ideas were literally quoted and embraced. I mean, let's go to the extreme here, by Nazi Germany. So, you know, Friedrich Nietzsche, right? His ideas percolating in the end of the 1800s, that the world had become too civilized, too soft, too reliant upon machines in the Industrial Revolution, and had become decadent and soft and immoral, and that it needed to return to its primal Darwinian roots, right? Get back to just its basics, get back to a primal militarism, and because undergirding a lot of these worldviews and these ideologies was Darwinism, okay? And not that Darwinism has to have an immoral, logical, you know, impact, but you definitely can make the argument that it has. Not that it necessarily has to, but it has, arguably. So this idea with social Darwinism, right? That just the premise that life is about hostility to your survival. That if you sit back, if you are too comfortable, if you are too stagnant and don't change and evolve, that there are just a myriad of forces in the world that want to gobble you up, and that you have to get aggressive, you have to get forceful, and embrace, like I said, kind of a more militaristic, worldview, or else you're going to get gobbled up. So Herbert Spencer, Thomas Huxley, and these other social Darwinists became very arguably in vogue in the late 1800s, after the 1859 publication of The Origin of Species by Darwin. And so they were taking Darwin's ideas of natural selection and survival of the fittest, and they were applying them to societies, right? And so some people, there were lots of derivations of that. So some people contended, okay, the main thing is technology, right? That you have to embrace modern technology, in particular, military technology, or else you're going to get gobbled up, right? Some people contended that, you know, you kind of quoting Nietzsche indirectly, if you don't move, you die, right? Like a shark. You have to keep moving forward. You have to keep expanding, or else the natural laws of digression and will occur. And so you had people like Alfred Thayer Mahan, Mahan, who was in a key position in the U.S. military and political establishment, who wrote his influence of sea power on history. And in that book, right, he emphasized that the way of the future is commercialization, is globalization, particularly economically. And the best way to ensure that your country's survival is carried out, is secured, is to have a powerful military and an aggressive military policy, whereby you engage in geopolitics, right? To me, geopolitics is you deal with contingencies, you deal with what ifs. You look at the globe as like a chessboard, right? And you think, okay, where are our vulnerable spots? the what ifs, right? Well, perhaps at this time we were thinking that Germany and England in particular were threats. Also in the 1890s, they were already beginning to view in Western civilization Japan as a threat. And so they would look at the map and say, okay, where would that Japan or Germany or England pose the greatest, most likely threat, right? And then when you look at that part of the map, you have to ensure that your country's best interests are secured in that area. So let's say whether it be the Caribbean or the Pacific Ocean, right? You're looking at the Samoan Islands or Hawaiian Islands, or you're looking at the one of the French Caribbean islands. What you must not do is take no for an answer. You start off with a quid pro quo offer and tell that island country, right? Hey, I'll tell you what, we will provide a plethora of manufactured goods and other economic incentives for you in return for you to allow us to keep a coaling station. A coaling station was like an AM PM at that time, right? A place to grab coal and to burn it on your steam engines of your ships to keep them fueled. And so, okay, so in return, we want a coaling station only for us, right? Or we want trade and we want you to buy commodities, industrial products only from us. But the problem is what if they say no, right? Under geopolitics, right? It oftentimes has been labeled as amoral. It doesn't think about what's moral or immoral. It just thinks about what yields the most practically, beneficial results. And so then you start getting nasty with that little island country if you have to. And you start threatening them. You start threatening to withhold something from them. You start threatening a military invasion if need be, right? So a lot of these ideas on number one, right, were in and of themselves arguably amoral. They didn't lean toward being immoral nor morally upright, but they lent toward pragmatism, whatever brought about the most practical, beneficial results for your country and your people first and foremost. You had Gobineau and Chamberlain, who wrote, and these were well-respected scientists, who would later, of course, be quoted by Nazi Germany, in contending that they believed that there was going to be a race, if you will. They cited Malthus, Malthus. Remember, Malthus was kind of like, I call him the Mad Max guy, right? The road warrior guy with those dystopian movies. The idea that there will not be enough resources for all the people in the world, that the population is burgeoningly growing, and it will outstrip the ability of the world to provide enough resources for everyone in it. And so hence that there's going to be an almost apocalyptic battle between different countries and nations and peoples, etc., right? So Gobineau and Chamberlain, they made it out into, quote, racial categories and believed that the Europeans and the Asians and the Africans and others were going to have this apocalyptic battle for scarce resources. So all of this, right, is going on at the same time in the late 1800s, right at the time when especially European and the United States governments are developing and building a modern steel navy, are beginning to impose their will on smaller island nations, are beginning to get into diplomatic and even possibly military confrontations over these small countries and over resources and access to certain trade routes, etc. And so, according to number one, it's not a coincidence. It's court history. It's contending that basically the United States felt as if we had to get more aggressive. We had to do such for our own survival, right? That it was what it was, that it was inevitable. Conflict, strife, competition was inevitable. And you either are prepared to win or you're not. Okay. And so definitely number one, right? It's meant to lean toward court history, to try to excuse what we did, and contending that there was this notion that we felt it was necessary to get aggressive like this and to become an imperialistic nation. All right. And so, you see the ideas here, like I said, Nietzsche, the different social Darwinists, Mahan over sea power, Malthus over scarce resources, right? And then look for evidence in one, right? Try to connect it to paternalistic US government in these countries. As supposed evidence that we genuinely adhere to these beliefs. So, for instance, right, there are some really good books on the United States government involvement in Puerto Rico and, in particular, in the Philippines. When you look at Theodore Roosevelt, for instance, and other leaders of that time period, they have um, a rich trove of writings to their family members, to themselves in a diary, to just progeny, to future generations, and different written accounts. They left a lot of writing in their wake. And in that writing, people like Teddy Roosevelt, right, contended at least that there was much belief, there was a strong uh, conviction in these types of beliefs that were percolating at that time, and even going so far as to alleging that they were idealistic, that they felt as if not only it was necessary to get aggressive as a nation, but that it was a win-win situation, right? In particular, right? The notion at that time that was called the white man's burden. The idea, right, that if we go in and we take over for our own, admittedly for our own benefit first and foremost, small nations like Puerto Rico and the Philippines, etc., right? That if we help catch them up to speed and we modernize their institutions, we give them a modern, technologically sound military, we give them a modern education and school system, we give them modern hospitals and medical institutions, right? That we're doing them a favor in the long run. That if we weren't to have taken them over, someone else with less altruistic intentions would have done so at the peril of this small country. And that hence it's a win-win situation. We're admittedly uh, taking care of number one first as a nation, right? The United States first. However, in the meantime, we are also modernizing these peoples and these island nations. So, like I said, especially in the Philippines, arguably, you could find a lot of evidence of millions of American tax dollars going into a school system, water and sewage systems, health and sanitation programs, hospitals, and different sanitation programs. Like I said, um, and even have quotes from Teddy Roosevelt and other leaders whereby they expressed a sense of a headache, right? A sense of stress, and saying that these countries were a heavy burden to us, but it was our idealistic burden to bear, right? As a special, exceptional country. And so also what you might be thinking of also with number one and stuff, what was difficult for me in putting number one together is how do you quantify the influence of ideas? Okay, you could do basic things like look at, okay, a different a different idea, or one of these intellectual leaders, how many books did he or she sell? What percentage of the literate population seem to have bought and arguably read his or her works? You look at leaders, like I said with Teddy Roosevelt, and you look at their own writings and speeches and say, okay, to what extent do they quote these people and in written or verbal form, attest to their having been influenced by these ideas. But then if you go that route as well, right? How do you know their sincerity? How do you know they're not justifying what they did and have ulterior motives? And so it's to me, that's the frustrating but yet kind of fun part of number one, is it's kind of slippery ground. It's hard to really prove or disprove, arguably, the influence of ideas. Uh, and then, of course, you have to look at, okay, are you doing great man history? Are you just looking at, key players who had positions of power that mattered. And then in that case, if you adhere to great man history, you have at least something to stand on. So for instance, Benjamin Tracy, who was a Secretary of the Navy. You have, like I said, Alfred Thayer Mahan, who served the U.S. government in several capacities. You have John L. Stevens as the ambassador to Hawaii. You have Secretary of State James G. Blaine. You have senators like Henry Cabot Lodge and others. Those that I just mentioned, you could find plenty of quotes from these intellectuals by those leaders. And they were in key positions of power, right? And they claimed that by their own admission, if it could be trusted, that they were definitely influenced by those ideas and making their decisions and helping the U.S. to build a modern Navy in 1883, right? And getting the modern equipment for it. The new Navy, by the way, the battleships would be named after states, right? Like all the way through Pearl Harbor. And so the first famous one was the USS Iowa. And so a much stronger military capacity, what they called first strike capability, right? And when you look at the Spanish-American War, when we got involved in the Philippines, Puerto Rico, and Cuba against Spain, ostensibly to help Cuba gain her independence, you look at the naval battles in particular, they were very one-sided. You look up a poor guy named Cervera, Cervera. This Spanish naval leader in Cuba was absolutely annihilated at Santiago de Cuba, outside that city, when we did a naval barricade across Santiago, and he tried to run that through that barricade. It was a very one-sided fight. Same thing with a guy named Sampson, an American leader named Sampson, another guy named Dewey, Dewey, in the Philippines. We attacked May 1st, 1898, Manila at about dawn. And by 12:30 in the middle of the day, Manila had a white flag up. So very one-sided fights. That's why John Hay, the Secretary of State, made the semi-sarcastic comment that this was a splendid little war, that we gained quite a bit from it, resource-wise and geopolitically on the map, and we paid very little in return for it because it was such a kind of a seemingly one-sided, quick, easy fight against Spain. So, we had our senators of key Senate committees, our people in the Naval and War Department, our Secretary of States like Blaine and others. They prepared us for this, right? At least 10 to 15 years prior to that war in 1898, by getting the U.S. prepared with a much more forceful foreign policy and a much more technologically powerful military. Okay. And so, going back to the Spanish-American War, you also have the role of the press. It was called yellow journalism. And with yellow journalism, the press is going to run with terrible stories of how the Spaniards were treating the poor Cuban people and likening the Cuban cause to the American War for Independence a century before this, right? And trying to elicit sympathy from Americans for the cause of a free Cuba, an independent Cuba from Mother Spain. And so then, it's which one is really pushing which one, right? Who's being manipulated by whom? To what extent did the press, a guy named Stephen Kinzer in his book called Overthrow states that there was scarcely another case in modern history where there was such a profound change in public sentiment as what happened with yellow journalism, and how suddenly within just about 5-year span, so many Americans began to push for involvement in helping Cuba gain independence from Spain. And then, of course, to what extent were they being manipulated by journalists, right? Like Hearst and Pulitzer and others. And to what extent also, right, were they playing right into the hands of some of those individuals that I mentioned earlier, key senators on Senate committees, key people in the president's cabinet, and in the naval and war departments and army departments, etc. And so it's tough. It's very messy. But what we do see is an American involvement in both sides of both houses of Congress, giving power to President McKinley, William McKinley, to fight the Spanish, to help out the cause of a free Cuba, a free Philippines, and free Puerto Rico, ostensibly, right? Because we never left Puerto Rico, and we didn't leave the Philippines until after World War II. So at any rate, that's the Spanish-American War. We got involved and threw our weight around in Latin America beneath us, right? You have something called the corollary, or the amendment or addition to the Monroe Doctrine, made by Teddy Roosevelt, Roosevelt's corollary to the Monroe Doctrine. Remember, the Monroe Doctrine from your 101 class goes back to 1823, when we declared the American hemisphere off limits for European powers and European imperialism. So the corollary, the addition, right, made around 1900, this one was not directed to the Europeans, as was the original Monroe Doctrine. This corollary was directed toward the Latin Americans themselves, right? And it basically stated that, as a history, Harvard, ex-Harvard student, President Roosevelt contended there seemed to have been two reasons why Latin American countries kept getting gobbled up by European powers. One was that they were being financially irresponsible and not paying back their debts. And then the Europeans, with their joint unions of their national banks, private banks, and their national governments, would come in and begin running the budget of these Latin American countries until they got their money back, running the customs offices, etc., and paying themselves back. And so hence it was like a way for them to get into the door of these countries when these countries would not pay back their debts. And then secondly is when the countries were politically unstable, when they were having coups, right? C-O-U-P, a blow to the state, revolutions, civil wars. And you find that in the Dominican Republic and Haiti, right? In these other countries, and in the Caribbean and in Latin America. And so Teddy Roosevelt tells the Latin American countries, literally, he used the term behave. That's how paternalistic his rhetoric was toward Latin Americans, right? That we're like their father figure, the great Anglo-Yankee Americans, and telling Latin America, you must behave. If you are economically irresponsible and or if you are politically unstable, he said, we, the United States, will come in and clean house in your country. We will intervene. We will pay back your debts for you, or we will provide an election and a free election for you to elect your leader, and then we'll leave. And then as far as, the complexity of all this, I would argue that we were 50-50. We had cases in which we came in and had a general election when there was chaos going on, like in Haiti. And when the election results came, our troops left to imply that we may have really genuinely, our leaders may have genuinely adhered to these beliefs of this generation and felt like we were a force for good for the world, and that we were kind of a paternalistic power that was leading the way for these, quote, backward, lesser developed countries. And then about 50% of the time we stayed long after the election results to show that we probably had ulterior motives. So at any rate, yeah. So, all this is to be considered. This is a really rich subject. There's tons of data, lots of facts, lots of different wars and theaters and areas of struggle, diplomacy and almost battles and sometimes war. in the late 1800s and early 1900s in the Caribbean and the Pacific, particularly. And look at this paternalistic picture, right? Look at Uncle Sam looking at these quote backward childlike nations, Hawaii, Philippines, Puerto Rico, Cuba, and he is trying to uplift and civilize, right, these quote backward peoples. Picture's terrible, isn't it? So far, are there any questions? Yeah, if you do, feel free to go ahead and unmute yourself or just text me the question. You guys are quiet. All right. And then with number two, right? The arguably the title says it all. Is the other component to court history. So we talked about the first component of court history, right? Is you can't deny what we did, right? As far as defending the country, but you can contend that we felt it was necessary, and that we genuinely believed in those ideas and the necessity of getting more aggressive as a country. And then secondly, the other component is that we were hesitant bullies, right? We were the quiet guy in the bar who did not want to fight, and the fight came to us instead. So then you do some great man history of Grover Cleveland and William McKinley as successive presidents in the 1890s, and you look for plenty of opportunities for them to have declared war prior to it happening, and them failing to do so, right? That if they really truly wanted to go to war, they would have had multiple opportunities to do so, yet they did not. And so you have evidence, look for evidence of lobbyist groups, like especially in Cuba, these juntas, these committees that were formed in Florida and New York, and other areas in exile of Cuba, and they were literally trying to foment sentiment in the U.S. to go to war with Spain and help Cuba. And first Grover Cleveland and then William McKinley displayed evidence of not being interested in wanting to get sucked into a war against Spain. Okay. You have also the window of the 5th and 14th Amendments, right? The 5th and 14th Amendment state that it's the federal government's job to protect the life, liberty, and property of Americans. What does that mean overseas as well? It depends on the administration. It's been inconsistently carried out. But nevertheless, at times it has been carried out with that broader definition, that the government ought to protect American property even overseas. And so you have that famous number of 50 million. People contending that 50 million American dollars were invested in the island of Cuba and were at risk because the guerrilla fighters, right? Remember, guerra is war in Spanish, so guerrilla is little warfare. They were fighting guerrilla or little warfare in these countries because they couldn't take Spain on toe to toe with numbers and ammunition and weaponry. And so they would fight them in little lightning raids, burn down pro-Spanish plantations, and then go into hiding and then strike again, etc. Right? And so when this was happening, Americans were losing their property, dual citizens, those who had both Cuban and American citizenship. And so that could have been a pretext. That could have been a convenient excuse for our government to get involved early on in this war, when war broke out in 1895, 3 years prior to our war in Cuba. And then, of course, there were references of it's more arguable in the Philippines how much the Filipino insurgents wanted our help. If you're interested, look up Katipunan, Katipunan. That was the Revolutionary Party of the Filipino people. And some of them wanted U.S. help and some of them did not. So something if you're interested looking further into. And notice this picture of that young emaciated boy in the middle there. They had a reconcentration program in Cuba, the Spanish that is, whereby if they were in areas where guerrilla warfare was rife and they felt they couldn't trust the population, they forced them out of their villages and into concentration camps. And our yellow journalists were taking pictures of this stuff and showing how awful the Cuban people were being treated. So, like I said, there arguably was more of a lobbyist pull for our help, more publicity to try to elicit our sympathy for Cuba than there was for Puerto Rico or for the Philippines. So, which lends to the question, right? Well, did the Philippines and Puerto Rico even want our help? Because they got it anyway, whether they wanted it or not. And so, for instance, we gave an ultimatum. Our president McKinley gave an ultimatum to Spain and said, you have to come to terms with which the Cubans and the others agree, or else we as a country you have a certain timeline. We gave them until like April 26th. You have a certain timeline to do this by, or else we're going to intervene as a country and help these decolonizing powers out. And of course, they didn't come to terms, right? Because especially in Cuba, they wanted nothing less than independence. And back in Spain, even the Liberal Party, under a guy named Prajedes Sagasta, they were willing to give something kind of like Canada under Great Britain. They were willing to give limited autonomy to these island countries so that they could run their own domestic policies, have their own parliament and president, right? But yet Spain would still control their foreign policy and their armed forces. And what's interesting is Puerto Rico, the leadership of Puerto Rico under Muñiz Rivera, they actually accepted these terms, right? And we still sent troops to Puerto Rico to help liberate the Puerto Ricans. Well, how do you liberate them when they didn't ask for it, right? When they agreed on terms with Spain?